Chapter 44. The Truth. "Hello, Tanny," a voice boomed. Reyes recognised the voice instantly. He moved a little so that he could look over his shoulder at the speaker. It was Orsa the Minotaur. Orsa slept in the bed next to Reyes, and the two had gotten to know each other fairly well as a result. Orsa had a deep guttural voice, deeper even than the other Minotaurs of the Hope. There was a large scar about his neck. It suggested Orsa may have once worn a slave's chain. Reyes felt it looked more like a slash from a sword. "Oh, hello, Orsa," Reyes greeted tiredly. Trying to talk to Orsa like this was awkward and uncomfortable. It was hard to move too much without risking waking Gagara, but he tried to inch himself a little closer to her so he could roll over a little bit more without falling off his side of the bed, and thus converse with the Minotaur from a more comfortable angle. "In each other's arms again, I see," Orsa commented. He feigned minor irritation, glancing quickly up to the ceiling. "As always," Reyes replied cheerfully. "As always." To emphasize the point, he turned his attention back to Gagara for a moment and kissed her gently on the forehead. Then he turned his head back towards the Minotaur. Gagara smiled in her sleep, and her eyes began to flicker, as if her body couldn't decide whether it was going to stay asleep or wake up. The great Minotaur groaned to himself, and then sat on the edge of his bed. Now, Minotaurs tend to vary in height between 8 and 10 foot tall. They towered over the average harpy, and were extremely strong to boot. As strong as a harpy might be, a Minotaur could have as much as twice the strength. However, the beds supplied by the elves for their soldiers to sleep on were no more than 6 feet long. They were beds made by elves with elves in mind, and no thought was given to those who might need extra leg room. Orsa had supplemented his bed by attaching large wooden boards to the end of it. The boards didn't look all that comfortable, and they had no support at the foot, but at least the Minotaur could stretch out without having to feel too restricted. Now awake, Gagara lifted her head a little so she could see over Reyes, and then commented, bleary-eyed, "Hi, Orsa." Gagara then yawned rather loudly. Reyes turned his head quickly to look at Gagara to confirm she was awake, and then he turned his attention back to Orsa. "Gaggy, I saw what happened to your mother," Orsa said to Gagara. "You have my deepest condolences." "Thank you," Gagara replied. She yawned again. "I appreciate the sentiment." From her tone it was clear to Reyes that Gagara was feeling a lot better now that she had gotten a few hours' sleep. She placed her head on Reyes' shoulder and smiled up at Orsa. "I'll admit I'm glad it went no further," Orsa said. "I heard the Emperor mention Minotaurs, and there are only 6 of us in the regiment anyway. Chances are high that I would have been one of those selected." "I'm also glad it went no further," Reyes said. "I think Darty stopped him." Orsa shook his head a little. "No one stops the Emperor. He is all-powerful. If Darty even tried, his head would probably be gracing one of the spikes at the palace even as we speak. No, Darty may have advised the Emperor that it wasn't a good idea, but he didn't stop him." Reyes nodded doubtfully. There had been more to that conversation between the Emperor and his mage advisor than just a suggestion. Otherwise, why shield the entire conversation with a silence spell? "You may be right." "Well, anyway," Orsa commented, "I'm sure Gaggy doesn't want us going on about the events of the day." He pulled Reyes' 2 silver bracelets from his pocket. "Aggie asked me to give these to you." "My bracelets," Reyes declared. "Thank you, Orsa." "No problem," Orsa said. He dropped the bracelets between Reyes and Gagara. "Oh, and she asked me to tell you that the little task you asked her to deal with has been dealt with." "Task?" Reyes repeated. Then he nodded. Orsa meant that the bodies had been disposed of. "Oh yes, that task. Thank you, Orsa." "No problem," Orsa replied. "Task?" Gagara asked. "Don't worry about it," Reyes told her. He reached across and kissed her again. "If you say so, handsome," Gagara replied, and then she nuzzled her head against Reyes' shoulder. Orsa lay down on his bed. His head rested on the wooden pillow. He lay flat on his back with his feet using every single inch of the boards that he had added to the foot of his bed. Orsa's horns were so large that they stuck out a little on either side of the bed. This meant that he had to sleep either on his back or his front. In addition, Orsa's frame was so large that the bed creaked under him a little, and the boards that he had added to the end actually bent a few inches. The evening grew on. Slowly, all the conversations that had been taking place throughout the barracks began to die down. More and more of them started to snore. Orsa was the loudest of all those snoring, though it seemed likely that Reyes' location in the bed next to the great Minotaur might have had something to do with that. Even Gagara had fallen asleep again. She was resting one arm over his, and though she couldn't actually be described as snoring, she seemed to be breathing quite contentedly. It was very dark, too dark for Reyes to see the form of Gagara lying in the bed next to him. He could sense her. He could feel her. He could even hear her, but he couldn't see her. Reyes waited until he was sure everyone in the barracks was asleep. Then he continued to wait. He waited for what he estimated to be close to another hour before he finally began to stir. He began by lifting Gagara's arm very carefully from where it had settled on his side. Gagara grumbled a little and resisted having her arm moved, but she didn't wake up. Then, moving slowly, trying to make no noise because he didn't want to wake anyone up, Reyes slowly extricated himself from the bed. First, he inched his feet out so that they were hanging loosely over the edge of the bed, and then he moved slowly to a sitting position, and from there, it was a simple matter to stand up. The next thing Reyes did was cast a spell. As dark as the barracks were, the cat sight spell was a necessity. He knew roughly where the door of the building was, but there was no way he could make it to that door without disturbing someone if he had to feel his way there. Once he had cast the spell, everything became so much clearer. He could see the garments that had been casually dumped on the floor by their owners. He could see the poles that supported the roof of the barracks, and the iron bucket that lay on its side where it had rolled after being knocked over. He could see the bed extensions that Orsa had added, and alterations that some of the others had made to their beds. Reyes turned and looked at Gagara. She looked so sweet and lovely while she was asleep. It was a shame to disturb her. For a moment he considered waiting until morning. He could take her on a hunting trip, just the two of them, and then tell her everything. No, Reyes decided. He had to get to the castle tonight. He might already be too late to haunt here, but if he waited until morning and his brother chose that day to leave for the wedding, then he was sure he'd never forgive himself. Almost regretfully, Reyes leaned gently over the bed and kissed Gagara lovingly on the forehead. "What are you doing?" Gagara asked. From the sound of it, she was still quite sleepy. "Shh," Reyes replied gently. He didn't want to alert everyone in the barracks that he was awake. "I'm just nipping outside for a little while. I need some air. I thought you might like to come with me." "What about the curfew?" Gagara whispered. She sat up, sounding more than a little concerned. "I'll take my chances," Reyes whispered back. "This is important." "Hold on a second then," Gagara replied. She climbed off the bed and used her hands to feel her way slowly round to his side. "I can't see a thing." "Oh, sure," Reyes whispered. "Let me fix that." He cast a second cat sight spell, this one aimed at Gagara. There was no point in his being able to see clearly if she bumped into everything and woke everyone up. "What the?" Gagara suddenly exclaimed, startled. "Shh," Reyes insisted. He looked about the barracks worriedly, but no one seemed to have heard her outburst and woken up. "Can you see?" "I can." Gagara was clearly trying to keep her voice down, despite her amazed tone. "Please don't do that again without warning, though." "Come on," Reyes whispered. "Carefully now." Reyes led the way to the door. The wood of the floor of the barracks was old and suffered from woodworm in a lot of places. Occasionally there was a small hole big enough to stick a foot through, and the floorboards creaked with every step. Reyes was terrified that any noise would wake up one of the others. Gagara followed close behind Reyes, virtually keeping to his footsteps. There was a nasty moment when stepping on the floorboards close to the toppled bucket caused enough of a vibration to make the bucket rattle and even roll a little. And there was also quite a heart-stopping moment when one of the snorers suddenly stopped snoring exactly adjacent to where Reyes happened to be standing, only to roll over in his sleep. Finally, reaching the door of the barracks, Reyes silently released the breath that he had been holding. Then he carefully took another and prepared to open the door. He had heard this door open and close many times since he had joined the Hope. It was loud. Perhaps it sounded louder to him because he was a harpy, but then he and Gagara weren't the only harpies in this building. Reyes wrapped his hand around the handle and pushed. The ill-fitting door resisted opening, and Reyes had to put a little more strength into it. It was impossible to open this door either slowly or quietly. The door opened with a loud thump as it came free of its frame, and an even louder creak as it swung open. Reyes quickly glanced beyond where Gagara was standing at the rest of the sleepers in the barracks. It was hard to believe that not one of them had been woken by the sound, and yet no one seemed to be stirring. "Shall we?" Gagara suggested in a whisper. She moved to leave the barracks. "Hold on," Reyes said, also in a whisper, reaching out an arm to block her departure. "I want to check the coast is clear." He looked up at the sky overhead. He could only see very little of the world beyond the door of the barracks, but in that area at least, there was no sign of any of those telltale glows that would warn of an eye currently passing overhead. Reyes took a single step outside. This gave him a much wider view of the sky above the barracks, and he could still see no blue glow. "Okay," he told Gagara, The area looks clear. Come on. Are you sure? Gagara asked uncertainly. Reyes nodded. He looked about some more and took a few steps into the compound. There's not an eye in the sky. Gagara seemed a little doubtful as she joined him, asking, You can see them? Magic, Reyes explained. He looked around the compound. Despite the curfew, there was a little bit of activity. Mainly, there were 2 guards on the gates. The goblins killed by the Emperor and his retinue earlier that day had already been replaced, and there was now an elf and a harpy on duty there. There was also an officer of the watch somewhere in the compound, though Reyes couldn't see him at the moment. What are we doing out here? Gagara pleaded. Come with me, Reyes said. The harpy on guard duty made things a little awkward, since Reyes didn't want his conversation with Gagara to be overheard. He took Gagara by the hand and led her over to one of the corners of the compound, as far from the guards on the gates as he possibly could, and hopefully out of earshot. Gagara followed a little reluctantly. She kept looking up as if expecting that she might get zapped away at any second. She looked and sounded very nervous as they reached the corner of the compound. Handsome, please. A simple wire fence surrounded the compound of the Hope. It looked fairly easy to climb over, and Reyes knew from experience that it was extremely easy to fly over. It had often made Reyes ponder the reason why they even bothered to post guards on the gates in the first place. Reyes glanced into the sky again, checking that the area was clear of eyes. He saw a hint of something blue hover on the skyline somewhere to the west, but it was a long way off, and didn't appear to be getting any closer. What's this about? Gagara asked. Reyes didn't know how to broach the subject. How do you tell someone you love that you're really loyal to one of their enemies? In the end, although he hated to do it, he felt it best to remind Gagara of something he had said earlier. Do you remember you said you wanted to leave the Hope? Oh, handsome, Gagara said. I was feeling emotional. Where would we go? I always fancied a trip to the mountains. There should be a few spaces up there for us, with so many villages in the city, but it could prove a hard life with just the 2 of us, hunting, cooking, making our own weapons, and fending off attacks from other villages. Oh, I'm really not sure that's such a good idea after all. Maybe other villages wouldn't attack, Reyes suggested. A male, with only one huntress to protect him, Gagara said, and who might one day prove to be a threat to their males? Oh, we'd be attacked. Somewhere else then, Reyes suggested. In a way, Reyes was glad. He did feel quite an affinity to the idea of living on the side of a mountain, but it wasn't really where he wanted to go this night. If Gagara thought going to the mountains was a bad idea, then he wouldn't have to talk her out of it. Yes, but where? Gagara said. She sighed. I was thinking we might go south, Reyes suggested. Gagara almost laughed. South? Into human territory? Yes, Reyes said. If we go to the mountains, I expect we'll be dead within a week. If we go to Florif, we'll be dead by morning. I thought you knew better from your own experiences that humans and harpies don't really get along. Reyes looked to the ground at his feet for a moment. Even now he was unsure how he should broach the subject. She was his girlfriend and the mother of his future child. Why was he having so much trouble telling her the truth? He looked at Gagara and asked, What would you say you knew about me? Well, we've gotten to know each other for over a year now. I'd say I've gotten to know you quite intimately, Gagara said with a grin. Reyes smiled and commented, That's not exactly what I mean. I know, Gagara remarked. What do you want me to say? You escaped from some castle in Demoth and arrived in Goldspawn without a clue as to what life was going to be like here? You couldn't fly, you could hardly talk, and yet you were the most wonderful thing I'd ever seen in my life. Reyes felt a little embarrassed, so he decided to quickly add, Then perhaps I should tell you it was the king I was on the run from, not the Duke, Gagara finished from him. I know that. The Duke kept you as a pet. It was only when the king discovered that you were being kept there that you were sentenced to death. You escaped, killed many soldiers, and stole a pair of bracelets and a valuable sword before you fought your way out of the castle. It's only a shame that you didn't kill the Duke, or any other member of the noble family. Reyes didn't remember telling Gagara any of that. He assumed that she must have filled in a few gaps in his story with embellishments of her own. It wasn't exactly like that. Oh? Gagara asked. Reyes decided to check the sky again for any sign of an eye, though even as he did so, he knew he was really just playing for time. The Duke's daughter, a woman called Jenny, Reyes said. Oh, I've heard of her, Gagara commented. She's the one that's getting married to the Crown Prince sometime soon. That's her, Reyes declared. She and I were always very good friends. We were like brother and sister even. When I was locked in the tower waiting my execution, it was she that came to rescue me." "She did?" Gagara asked, surprised. "There's more," Reyes added. "Everything I left the castle with that night was a gift from one of the Duke's children. The belt I got from Greyforth, and the money was a gift from Tia. The bracelets were from Jenny, and the sword was a gift from their mage Mangloss." Gagara looked a little puzzled for a moment, and then she said, "I guess they must have really loved you. It still doesn't mean we'd be welcome." "This may be hard for you to hear," Reyes said. He sighed as he pondered how to word it. "You see, I wasn't just some pet being kept by the Demoff family. The Duke actually adopted me into their family. My real name is Reyes Demoff. I am the third son of Duke Grunhay and Duchess Breardine Demoff." He flinched, closed his eyes, and awaited her verbal barrage. Gagara looked stunned. She even took a step back. "Don't you see," Reyes said. He opened his eyes to address her again. "I understand your hatred for the Demoff family. It may have been they who destroyed your village. Yet those same humans who may have been responsible for making you and your mother homeless also took pity on a poor defenceless harpy baby, adopted her into their own family, and treated her like their own child. They taught me how to use a sword, and even how to wield magic. They even taught me some of the niceties of human society. I think they will accept us." "You are my male," Gagara said meaningfully. "And?" Reyes pressed, unsure what that meant. "I will do as you wish," Gagara assured him. She approached and put her arms around him. Reyes fell into the hug. "I love you." "I love you too," Gagara said. "I'm still not sure this is a good idea, but it beats sitting around waiting to fight for an emperor who killed my mother." "And your hatred of Duke Demoff?" Reyes asked. "Can you find it in your heart to forgive her?" "We will see how she reacts to our arrival," Gagara said, grinning. She broke from the hug and launched herself into the air, hovering just above him. "I have never known what it was like to live in a village. Maybe it was your father that stole that from me, but if she hadn't, I might never have met you." Reyes joined her in the air a moment later, feeling clumsy in relation to how graceful Gagara appeared to be. "We need to gain as much height as we can first," he suggested as she reached her. "We need to get above the eyes, and I'd rather not be noticed by anyone that might just happen to glance up. At this time of night, the only ones likely to be out on the streets are the night wardens, and those with passes to be out, such as the ones guarding the gates to our barracks," Gagara told him. Reyes once remembered Jorvis mentioning the night wardens. He hoped Jorvis was still alive when it really hadn't been he who had been executed. The thought of Jorvis being burnt at the stake made him wonder what the penalty for breaking the curfew was. "Out of interest, what sort of punishment can we expect if we get caught?" "If we're very lucky," Gagara responded. "They might do no more than impale us. Being harpies, though, it's far more likely they'll burn us alive, or, even worse, put us in crows' cages and let us starve to death." "What, just for being out during the hours of darkness?" Reyes asked. "Oh no," Gagara replied, "for that would be forced to fight in the arena for the entertainment of the city's population. I thought you meant if we were caught giving intelligence to the enemy. The higher they flew, the colder it got, and the thinner the air got. After a while, the two harpies had no real choice but to decide they could go no higher and begin their journey south." Reyes really began to worry about what was waiting for him back at the castle. He could put on a brave face in front of Gagara and assure her he would be welcome back, but it had been over a year now since he had left. What sort of reception might they have waiting for him? It was entirely too possible that the soldiers on the walls might just shoot them out of the air as they approached. Then there was Gagara. Even if they accepted him, how might they treat his lady love? There wasn't exactly an open-ended invitation for harpies in Floreth. On the positive side, there were still 5 days before his sister's wedding. If Mangloss could create one of his marvels, there was still a good chance that Reyes could actually get to the capital to see the wedding coach as it made its traditional circuit of the city's streets. It wouldn't be the same as actually being allowed into the wedding, but it had to be better than nothing.